Hello, everyone. This is our fourth and final Reimagining State Tax Practices and Taxpayer Rights, our fourth workshop. And I'm Nina Olson, the Executive Director of the Center for Taxpayer Rights. And this workshop is on taxpayer advocates and taxpayer ombuds at the state level and taxpayer bills of rights, and also state funding for low-income taxpayer clinics to represent taxpayers, low-income taxpayers on state issues. And this is a good way to sort of wrap up our series, because we've spent 3 sessions looking at how things can go wrong, or what protections taxpayers need and where they might need assistance. And so we're really wrapping it up with 2 methods of assistance through the Taxpayer Advocate Office, or whatever it's called at the state level, and through representation by low-income taxpayer clinics. And I just want to remind you all that you are welcome to comment as we go along in the chat, share the experiences that you have with in your states, whether you have a taxpayer advocate or ombuds, or whether your state is contemplating or already has funding for representation in state tax issues. And if you have questions, certainly put them in the chat, and the moderators will be reading the chat to see how they're going along. If there are any questions that should be incorporated, and we may have time at the end to just let you ask questions. And we just really encourage you to participate. So I'm going to turn it over right now to Anna Gooch, our ABA Tax Section Public Service Festival. I keep saying that, fellow, our ABA Public Service Fellow. And we're going to have a festival because apparently I've named it as such. And Anna's going to talk about some of the results that we've seen with the state surveys that have come in so far relating to both of these issues. So Anna, do you want to share your little slide? Can
you all see that?
Yes.
Okay, great. And yes, I would attend a public service festival, so sign me up. So as Nina mentioned, we're going to share some results from the survey that we've been conducting, and this is sort of a culmination of everything. So this is taxpayer rights generally. I think everything, every step of the way, from tax return filing to collection to litigation, affects taxpayer rights, but this is just sort of more broadly what is going on at the state level. So I won't spend too much time on this because there are 2 really, really great panels today. But I just wanted to share some sort of initial results. So one thing that has been really great to see is that most states do have a taxpayer bill of rights. And one just distinction, if you are looking at this for yourself, for your own state, just make sure you're looking at TBOR and not TABOR. They're different. Taxpayer Bill of Rights, of course, TBOR, lists the rights that a taxpayer has when interacting with the state tax system, whereas TABOR is a constitutional amendment that lists, or that limits, how much revenue the state can bring in. So just to recap, most states have a taxpayer bill of rights that lists the rights that taxpayers have. In some cases, it will also list sort of reciprocal responsibilities that taxpayers have. They all look a little bit different. Some look really, really close to the federal taxpayer bill of rights, and some are completely different. Some have more rights, some have fewer rights. But the important thing is that most states do have one. 7 of the 10 states for which we have seen results do have a taxpayer advocates office or an ombudsman office. We'll hear from a few of them today, which is really exciting. So I won't say more on that because there's a whole panel coming up on them. And similarly, I actually think this needs to be updated to 5 of the 13 states we've heard from do receive some degree of, or the state gives some degree of funding to LITCs. Sometimes it's the state that gives it, sometimes it's a county. Sometimes it's a city, as we'll hear from in our first panel. Sometimes it's a department within the state. So like, an equivalent to something like a Department of Health and Human Services or something sort of on that provides similar services. So with that, I will turn it back to Nina to kick off our first panel. And I hope you all enjoy what we're going to hear about today, because I'm really excited. So thank you.
Thank you, Anna. So I think, what we're really trying to get done today, by the way, is for those states that don't have any of these programs, there would be a roadmap or opportunities to consider how to move forward. And what we're going to do in our project is propose model legislation for both the establishment of taxpayer advocates / ombuds offices at the state level, and then also maybe some model legislation that would provide for funding of, representation of low-income taxpayers on state tax issues. So we'll start the first panel by introducing David Sams, who is stepping in for Nancy Rossner, who's ill right now, suffering a flu. David is the executive director of the Community Tax Law Project in Richmond, Virginia, which was one of the original clinics in the funding program, and has just celebrated its 30-year anniversary last week. Yay. So David, why don't you introduce your panel?
Thanks, Nina. Yeah, our panel doesn't need much of an introduction, but today we're going to hear from Keith Fogg. Keith Fogg is an emeritus professor at Harvard Law School, where he directed the tax clinic for several years prior to his retirement. Before becoming a clinical professor, he worked for IRS chief counsel for 3 decades. And I can't believe I only have 2 sentences to talk about Keith Fogg, but that's what he gave us today. So next we have Janice Shih. She's the new director at the University of Baltimore, LITC. Prior to the University of Baltimore, she was director of the LITC at Maryland Volunteer Service, Maryland's largest and oldest provider of pro bono legal services. So welcome, Janice. And then we have Anna Travis is a senior staff attorney in the Workers' Rights and Benefits Unit at Brooklyn Legal Services. She joined the practice in 2011 as a Brunswick Public Service Festival and through the ABA section of taxation. Anna represents low-income taxpayers in controversies before the IRS and New York State, with a particular focus on issues affecting immigrant workers. She earned her JD from Boston College. Welcome, everybody. So, and as Nina mentioned, I'm stepping in for Nancy Rossner, and I'm basically following her notes. So we'll see how this goes. So first of all, let's let any of our panelists hop in on this one, Keith, Anna, or Janice. Why do we need state legislators to fund LITCs? I think this is a little bit obvious, but I'd like to hear your take on that, have the LITCs handling state income tax issues?
I can jump in. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. So, New York State and New York City provide their own versions of the earned income tax credit to families and individuals that are eligible at the federal level. And so I would say, that the state aggressively audits these benefits, but the state has also legislated to provide them. And so the state has a vested interest in delivering these economic benefits to families in need. And there's a real disconnect that we see in New York State between what's legislated and who's eligible and who's actually receiving these benefits due to a lot of barriers. We have a lot of limited English proficient taxpayers in our state and our city. And so there's a real gap that we see between need and who's actually receiving what's intended to go to them.
Thanks, Anna.
Massachusetts is similar to New York in that it has its own earned income tax credit. And they pre-audit every earned income tax credit before it goes out. So they look to see if you're a 1099 rather than a W-2, they don't pay your earned income tax credit. They send you a letter asking for more information because they're afraid that people are using 1099s to circumvent what should be proper earnings. So that automatically creates a lot of people who need help right off the hop. I would say that Massachusetts and New York both also use the licensing process very heavily in the collection area, so that it's easy for clients who owe even a small amount of money to lose their driver's license, among other licenses that they can lose. And New York has a more friendly driver's license law than Massachusetts. They actually let you drive to and from work. Massachusetts just takes your license straight out. So the EITC and the collection issues that come up in the state can be more pronounced. And I would say in Massachusetts, the state has funded the tax collection agency better than the IRS is funding its collection efforts. So there's more aggressive collection going on at the state level because they can't print money the way the federal government can. Then there is, and that's why there's a need for assistance. And there are, while the LITC grant allows you to represent individuals who also have a state problem, we had a number of clients who just had Massachusetts problems, and that's why it's important to be funded for Massachusetts.
Yeah, so we see the same thing in Maryland as both Anna and Keith alluded to. Our state is very aggressive, especially with driver's license holds and flags, and so that is usually the genesis of where most of our clients come from, because they can't drive, and that's frightening to them, of course. As far as the EITC, Maryland does offer its own EITC, but something that was very interesting with the pandemic was that they also expanded last year to offer the EITC to ITIN holders. And so that was sort of a whole new group of people that came in. So we have a new comptroller coming in. It was just elected, so hopefully we're hoping that some of these things will still remain. So.
Thank you. I'll provide a little bit on the Virginia perspective. Up until coming up, there was no statute of limitations on collections in Virginia. So you could very much have a Virginia issue lasting much longer or in separate years than your IRS issue. So there needed to be some way of addressing those specific issues as well, like Keith pointed out in Massachusetts. So let's back up a little bit and talk about prior to your funding search and your efforts. What steps did you take moving towards getting your funding, and what was the process like?
All right. Well, I mean, I'll start off, but I arrived in Boston in July of 2015 to start the Harvard Clinic, and very shortly after I arrived, I was introduced to the president of the Massachusetts Society of Enrolled Agents, and I talked to him about what a tax clinic does, and he got very excited. He was also the treasurer for one of the Massachusetts state senators, and he said, "Well, let me introduce you to my state senator, because Massachusetts should do something to fund a clinic the way that the federal government is funding clinics." So he arranged a meeting with his state senator, and a couple of other state senators joined in the meeting. And we had a very productive meeting that lasted for an hour or so. And out of that meeting, the state senators who were there, one of whom was a former legal services attorney, they pretty much outlined a plan of who we should talk to and what we should do to let the legislators in Massachusetts know about what they should do to fund a clinic so that Massachusetts citizens could be represented as well. And I drafted a statute for them to potentially use, and I just basically used 7526, except that I increased the people that we could represent to 400% of poverty, because 250% of poverty in Boston keeps you under a bridge. It's very hard to get housing in Boston, and just like it would be in New York or San Francisco at 250% of poverty. And I also did not put in a requirement that the funds be matched. The draft that I created was it was eventually, I mean, really pretty quickly passed by the legislature within but in the 2016 legislative session, it passed. And funding was set aside in the 2016 legislative session, but the governor, there was a procedure by which the governor could make adjustments to the budget, and he knocked out our funding. And got knocked out again in 2017, but in 2018 the funding started. By that point, the governor's office, discussions had been happening with the governor's office as to why this funding would be helpful. And since 2018, the funding has come to the clinic, and generally in the neighborhood of about $100,000, but it's a year by year thing, depending on how much money they have available. The funding is split between all of the clinics in Massachusetts evenly. I should also mention that Luz Arevalo in the Greater Boston Legal Services was also a very big partner in providing the information to Massachusetts legislators to enable them to make the decision to pass this legislation. And of course, the president of the EAs was the driver of the vehicle that led to this. The problem with the Massachusetts, so the clinic's getting, sometimes in some years more money from the state of Massachusetts than from the IRS. But it doesn't, you don't know how much you're going to get until the funding year starts. It's a very it has been a very ad hoc process. So we were working on making it less ad hoc as I left. So maybe in future years it will be more certain what will happen, because it makes it hard to staff. I don't know what's happening this year because I left, but in 2021, the tax clinic borrowed money from the other clinics at the Legal Services Center. We have a fund of money from attorney's fees, so we borrowed money for the first 2 months of the state grant year, hoping that the state grant would come through and we could retain an employee and not have to lay him off and bring him back on. And that worked, but that's an awkward thing. So that while there's been significant funding coming through the state, the process has not yet streamlined into a process that makes it easy to carry over employees. But that's how it came about. Really, John Warren, the president of the Massachusetts EA Society, deserves the lion's share of the credit for what happened.
David, I'm going to take moderator privilege and weigh in here, just for the beginning, since, I was the executive director of the Community Tax Law Project at the beginning, and how we got funding from the state really started in 1995 and 96, when welfare reform was going through, and we had been working with various state agencies about trying to do some communication. They kept pushing people into doing home daycare, and all those of us in tax were like, you're making them self-employed, they've got record keeping, deductions for home office, what are you doing? And we try to do training for them, and it was just like, there's just going to be a nightmare. So the state bar funds legal services, and we were not a legal services entity. All the legal services funding was running through the state bar budget. And so we approached the state bar about maybe they could add us to their budget. Well, it turned out that one of our board members, and I think this is a theme, that to get the process started, there needs to be somebody who's got a connection with someone else in the House or the Senate, whatever your governing body is. And one of our charter board members was the CPA partner, was the partner in a CPA firm with the state majority leader, the state Senate majority leader. So we went up the first year, one of our other board members lent us one of their attorneys to walk me through the paces of going up to the General Assembly and the Senate with a draft proposal in hand that we'd worked out with the state bar to do representation of Virginians who were receiving welfare, were being put into this welfare to work program. And knocked on doors, failed the first year. We had a Republican senator and a Democratic House member sponsoring it and tried to get names. And then we the second year we went up and we got some more names, but it wasn't until the third year when we actually had the Senate Majority Leader sponsoring it that it went through. And it was, it took a lot of education, like Keith is saying, but it was very, and it was a very interesting experience for me, just honing the 30-second elevator talk to meet with the members of the General Assembly or the Senate to convince them why low-income Virginians needed tax representation. But once you got through, they would sign on. And then the Virginia has a biennial budget. So at least there, once every 2 years what your number is going to be, although there could be rescissions and things like that in a special assembly. But at least you have some constancy. But it's always nerve-wracking, just like it is with the IRS funding. But that's how it happened with Virginia. And I think the other message about that is, we picked an issue that was of interest to the General Assembly and said there's a tax aspect to that. And I think just coming in sometimes purely with taxation, eyes glaze over. But if you can key it to some downstream effect of a policy that they're working on, then that becomes, or a policy they've already adopted, like the EITC, then you can really make more of a case than if you were just coming in saying, give money to low-income taxpayers. So now I'll go off, having done my moderator interview.
What I think you make a good point there, Nina, and you really need it's key to a person. And Nina described the initial funding process at CTLP, but whenever we've gotten our large increases, it's always been a board member who had a contact at the government and to be able to do that. And also you need something to tie it to. I've tried to pitch cost of living increases. That falls flat in Virginia, at least. But they do like right now in Virginia is a big push for a lot of government officials from the western parts of the state, from areas that are not reached so well. So we're working on a new increase that is tied to expansion rather than an issue. It's related to finding populations that are underserved. So Anna or Janice, you want to speak on that?
So I have a little bit of a unique perspective here in that we don't have funding at the moment for state tax controversy work. And I really, really wish we did. And I can talk about all the reasons why we need funding. Our funding was from 2004 to 2007. And it was part of a push in New York City, as Nina was talking about, sort of the welfare to work transition and the expansion of the earned income tax credit. It was part of sort of a general push and a general mood to increase access. And so the city funded our program to do work to expand access to the federal, state, and local EITC. And unfortunately, I think that the city's expectations for the turnaround time and the amount of time it would take for advocates doing controversy work to get the benefits in the hands of the New York City taxpayers was the expectation was that time would be much shorter than it actually was. And so in 2007, the city decided to reprioritize and redirect its funding more towards vital work because there's more of an immediate bang for your buck. And so unfortunately, we haven't had funding since then. We've done a lot of unfunded New York State controversy work when it's in conjunction with a federal case, which is often the case. And then we've done some unfunded advocacy work as well on behalf of folks whose driver's licenses are suspended. And we also did unfunded work to create a statute of limitations. Whereas much like Virginia, there used to be no statute of limitations. So yeah, that's our story, that we had funding for three fabulous years, and I'm hoping at some point we can get it again. Maybe it does take knowing somebody in the state legislature who will understand sort of the connection, as Nina said, like tying the tax issue to greater economic concerns in the state, and maybe that's what it will take to get refunded again.
Janice, before you give your story about your path to getting your funding, could you also talk a little bit about the focus of your funding? Because I know yours is not as general as the funding that Keith talked about in Massachusetts and that we have in Virginia.
Sure. Well, the focus of our funding really is to assist Maryland low-income taxpayers. Unfortunately, they were not as generous as Massachusetts in that our income level is at 200%. I argued with them that we should go to at least 250, but that did not happen, at least this year. So we're hoping in the future it does. It's pretty broad right now in that there's no specifics in terms of who we can help or in what capacity. So we're sort of crafting that as we go along now. We've really kind of kept it very similar to the IRS grant, just to not overwhelm ourselves at the moment, but it's pretty open, and it's split amongst three programs, three LITCs in the state of Maryland, two university programs, and my former legal services program, Maryland Volunteer Lawyer Service. So each one took it a slightly different way. The University of Maryland hired a staff attorney who does only Maryland cases. MVLS, we hired a paralegal to assist with all the Maryland cases that we were already doing without funding. And at the University of Baltimore, we've really focused on research and fellowship and funding a fellow position to sort of have an academic bent with it, as well as to increase our outreach to underserved populations. So, but in terms of getting the funding, it is absolutely very important to know someone. So this actually started prior to us getting, the year prior to us getting the funding, because it was a bill that was proposed in the legislature by one of the state delegates and the dean of the other law school, the University of Maryland, LITC, because they brought a bill to lift the restrictions on licenses, the license holds. The comptroller did not like that and pushed back because they felt that was their the only penalty that they could impose to get people to pay their taxes. So that did not pass that year. And so then that led to this, well, let's help low-income individuals. But it really came because we did have a state delegate who was an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. And so he kind of knew about this. And then luckily then his co-sponsor of the bill was a state senator who had worked at the comptroller's office before and saw the big mess that it was. So that really helped. But it did take a few years. The first year we did, then the pandemic hit. So that didn't pass the House, but not the Senate. And then so we had to go back the next year. So, but I thought what was really very effective. So I testified for MVLS, and then the two deans of the law schools were there, and the two deans were quite academic and very, they talked about the importance of teaching law students and such. But I was able to come at it with a much more, on the ground a discussion about who the clients were, and sharing our client stories. And I think that's really kind of, not that it was all me, but I think, being able to put it together with actual people and actual clients and seeing what does this actually mean for someone's life, I think that really helped to open their eyes. And so I even though there's all this academic stuff and the sort of the great theory of all the work we're doing, if you can tie it to a specific client and a specific issue, I think that really makes a much bigger impact.
I know there are a lot of LITC clinicians that are thinking about going in this route and going down that way. So, and one of the things that we always hear about is the burden of reporting on our LITC grants. Can you talk about a little bit about your reporting requirements to each of your states? I know, Anna, you don't have current funding, but you could talk about the funding you did have and what did you have to report back?
In Massachusetts, the report requirements are about 1/100th of the report requirements for the LITC program. I think it takes us about an hour to do it. So it would be a model for the LITC program to adopt. We only report like on the number of cases we work, very, very minimal amount of reporting to the state of Massachusetts. it's quite a delight, the reporting requirements. So I don't have much to say other than that it is not very difficult to report to Massachusetts at this point. I hope they never see publication 3319.
How about you, Janice?
I certainly agree with you. Our grant is kind of funny in that because it was written in such a broad fashion, we don't really have any specific deliverables at this point. So we met again because it was only for 2 years, and so we reported to the legislators what we did, but they didn't seem happy or sad in any way, so it was sort of hard to read them. They felt like it was going to be pretty easy to push it through again. Maybe they have another pot of money that they were going to pull from this time, but they really didn't ask any questions. It was very peculiar, especially coming off of the LITC grant. I really was worried, like, oh my God, what are we going to say to these people? But they just sort of said, okay, I think we can do it this way in the budget, and then they moved on. So we'll see how it goes next year.
Anna?
Sure. So I don't have personal experience with the grant from 2004 to 2007, but from what I have been told and what my supervisor, who was involved at the time, has said, that there was a pretty close working relationship with people at the New York City Department of Finance. And so I don't know that the reporting requirements were as formalized, but there was kind of a constant dialogue between the New York City Department of Finance and our clinic, and they were co-sponsoring outreach events, referring taxpayers who came to their office for assistance. And so I think that there was just a lot of collaboration and less sort of formal generating reports, like, which is understandable for a huge nationwide program like the Low Income Taxpayer Clinic program, where that, you're overseeing so many different clinics. But in our case, it was a much smaller world, and I think that there was a lot of collaboration between the funder and the grantee.
Just to jump back in and kind of emphasize what Anna said, I think a lot of state taxation work is very personal, rather than you don't have manuals to work with. A lot of times you don't have the same kind of statutes, and so we have a very close relationship with the Department of Revenue in Massachusetts. We met with them, and the collecting officers were happy to have us around. They would regularly tell their clients to call us up. I mean, so we didn't have revenue officers telling people to call us up, because at the IRS, revenue officers were generally dealing with higher end clients, and the clients that would come to the clinic would be clients dealing with ACS, and ACS wouldn't be referring them to us. But in Massachusetts, it was made known to every collector that we were there, and so they would have their clients call us up, so we would help the clients do the necessary paperwork to make them qualify for hardship, or to convince the taxpayer that they needed to pay. So I think Massachusetts felt like from its employees that they were getting a benefit out of the money, but they did not impose upon us the same kind of reporting requirements. I'm joking when I talk about Pub 3319, but just a very different relationship, much more personal, and much more grounded in the local things going on.
I have to say the Virginia perspective is like a strange crystal ball that's very foggy. So over the years, we've imposed our own 3319-ish reporting standards, because we're not exactly sure who reads it. We know who we submit it to, which is the Virginia State Bar. That's where we get our, as Nina mentioned, that's our general funding source. So the reports go to the Virginia State Bar, but we are careful to make sure that we do a little bit of internal advocacy on those in that report, to make sure that if it gets into the hands of the legislators that are going to be looking at, say, a funding increase, that it's going to be very pleasing to from a Virginia perspective. So we look at it both as a requirement twice a year, and also as a way of making sure we're advocating possibly in this, behind this strange crystal ball, we're not sure who reads it. So, yeah, I'd have to say it's much less burdensome than the forms for the regular LITC forms. So we have 2 clinics that have temporary or have finished their funding. What are your thoughts about getting more funding in the future? What are you planning to do, or where? And I know, Janice, you're not quite done your 2 years, right? It's you're still working on it. So Anna or Janice, you want to speak about how you're going to try to make this a long-term thing?
Well, we had a meeting with the legislators to show them what we've been doing. But as I mentioned before, it was a little bit challenging because we weren't really sure what they were looking for or how they were. And they didn't. Then when we actually met with them, they didn't seem too impressed or unhappy in any way. So it was really hard to say. I think part of it was for them was really trying to figure out sort of what pot of money in the state budget it would be coming from. And I guess they also felt that. So I think the bill, when it was originally written, it was coming from one pot of money, and then it said that it was actually subject to the governor approving it into the next budget. And then, so there was sort of this initial push of, let's see if the governor will go ahead and approve it. And then, but if he doesn't, then we'll bring it back up to the legislature. But then, we have this other pot of money now, and we can funnel it through that way. So from their perspective, it was more about where can we get the money than what are you doing with it, which was unusual for me because I felt like, we need to show that we're actually doing something with it. But they seemed happy. I didn't feel like our numbers in general were huge numbers, especially after we had sort of built up this great need. But I think it was also partly the pandemic. The state withdrew a lot, just like the IRS. They put a hold on collections, they lifted lights and halts and things like that. So people weren't feeling quite the squeezes they were pre-pandemic to get their tax issues taken care of.
I guess I would say if I had my wish in New York State, there is an Office of the Taxpayer Rights Advocate in New York State. And I think there's so much untapped potential in that position to really develop the position into something that's resembling a parallel to the National Taxpayer Advocate and TAS at the national level. And I think if I had my wish, we'd be collaborating closely with that office, and that office would be helping us sort of craft a pitch to the legislature to fund New York State controversy work. And so, yeah, I think there's a lot of untapped potential, and there's a way to sort of get that message across that the state taxpayer advocate can take up some of the concerns of low-income taxpayers whose needs and issues are really underrepresented. And so, yeah, I don't know if that can ever happen, but I think, with the newish administration that we have, but we'll see. Yeah, those are just my thoughts, just speaking, if I had my wish and how things.
Before Keith answers, I actually had a side question, if I may, which is, so of you all, is your funding run through the appropriation law, or is there, like in the IRS, in the Internal Revenue Code, there's a separate authorizing statute, and then so that's in the law, like they can't disappear that.
Takes 7 days. You'll need to
And
come in
then
early.
after that is the annual appropriation process, which is how much money you actually get. So I was wondering whether does that fit your legislative agenda, that you get an authorizing statute, and then what you have to do every year or every 2 years is how much money or where, do you get? So maybe, I don't know, but.
We are set in appropriations line of the Virginia State Bar. And so we have been, as you know, Nina, that since you got the original funding, we've been consistently getting that and increasing it since then. So I get a letter from the Virginia State Bar to agree or ask for an increase each year that I have to submit prior to them putting their full appropriations together, their whole package together for their amount that they're allowed. So most years we are happy just to keep going where we are, and we don't have a specific reason because they've made it very clear, unless you have a very good reason, don't mess around with it. Like with messy stuff like cost of living increases, things like that. They don't like those fall flat with the legislators. So
I think I relied on John Warren to be the person who would talk to the legislature, but after they created the statute, I think we became a regular line item that they would consider each year. And then they would decide each year how much they would appropriate to it, and it did vary year to year. But we weren't up there talking to them about how much to put into that. So we were fairly standoffish about what they would put in. But we had John who would talk to he would talk to his senator. So there was some discussion, usually done through our contact in the EAs, but I never spoke to the legislature on a year-by-year basis.
yeah, because of the way that Virginia State Bar does theirs, we don't have to do year to year go before the legislature. So that I like it that way, because we're sort of hidden in the bigger bill. And as long as that bill is funded, then we're okay. So
I think in Maryland, our money comes from the unclaimed properties section of the Maryland Comptroller. So we're totally different. I think that's why the legislators were just thinking, well, what pot can we access next, and where can we stick this? So it's a little bit, it's still evolving, I think.
do we have any questions from I don't see anything in the chat yet, but people can ask questions if they'd like. You can be as specific as you want, I think. Well, until we get some in there, what general advice would you give a clinician who maybe doesn't know anybody and they are looking to go down this road? What do you think would be their first steps, and who should they be contacting first before they to maybe head off some mistakes that they could make, or some things that you learned along the way that you think that would be important?
I learned that having somebody who knew a legislature was really important, and I think that was sort of echoed by Nina. So my advice to a clinic that wanted to do this, or in a state with more than one clinic, the clinics might want to band together. But certainly in Massachusetts, it wasn't just the Harvard clinic; it was Harvard with Greater Boston Legal Services. And there were two other clinics in the state, both of whom we kept in the loop. They were a little further afield, and it wasn't as easy for them to come into the legislature, but they were certainly a part of the process as well of providing information to the. So I would find an entree to some legislature, take the information that you're getting from this program about the programs that are being funded in Massachusetts, Virginia, and Maryland. Look at which one you want, create your own idea of what you want, and then go pitch it. And depending on how much, I think states with significantly high income tax, states that are doing a lot of collection work like Massachusetts and New York and Maryland, those are states where they've got to be seeing the need. When I ran the clinic at Villanova for 8 years, I think we only had 2 state tax issues come up while I was there. So there didn't seem to be a very robust state collection action going on at that time. But in Massachusetts, it's very robust. And so any state where you're encountering robust state activity, I think that finding an entree to a legislature, which could be through a big law firm. If you have pro bono ties to a big law firm, there would be somebody there who knows somebody on the legislature. That would be my suggestion.
I certainly agree with Keith. I think having an entree to a legislator is very important, but I think also just sort of knowing the tax people in your state. Maryland's a small tax community, and we certainly have a lot of ties with the Maryland Comptroller as well. And so when they actually supported our bill, because they knew that they would be getting more revenue later. That's how we couched it, is that, well, you'll be getting more revenue if we can get all these people back into compliance and paying their taxes and doing the right thing, then this will help you. And so they supported our bill, and I think that was really helpful to have their support, unlike the driver's license bill the year before where they were against us. So I think that's very important. Many years ago, when I first started at the MBLS, I had gone to the comptroller, to my contacts there, and asked them for money, to fund this. And they were like, "Oh yes, we think you're quite worthy, but we just don't have any money." So it had to come from the legislators. So, but I think just knowing everybody and networking and communicating with them really helped everybody to see that this is best for everyone all around.
Yeah, Janice, I think that's a great point. Networking with all different levels of your tax section of your state bar. That way everybody knows what you're doing, and they can, if you do get the ear of a legislator, they can, maybe talk to someone at one of the bigger firms, be like, "Oh, have you heard of this place?" But like, "Oh yeah, I'm on their board of directors," or "I do pro bono work for them," and legitimizes the work you're doing. So we do have oh, Anna, do you want to say anything on that one, or? Okay, we do have
I'm gonna jump back in for a second, Craig, just
Yeah.
to totally agree with what Janice said, and the MADOR supported our legislation, and that if they had not, I don't think it would have gotten off the ground. So it is important, and they have the commissioner of the MADOR has an advisory board, and Luz Arevalo from Greater Boston served on that board. We also met with MADOR or components of MADOR probably on an annual basis. For some, we had a meeting and we talk about how the hardship provisions were working, or we talk about how the earned income tax credit provisions were working. So we were regularly meeting with them, and I think they viewed the ability to meet with us as a value added to them, because we were providing them with information about what the taxpayers were seeing. So I think I totally agree with Janice that you need to show through your taxing authority that you're adding value to the system, and then have their support. And if you don't have their support, that it will be very hard to get a grant.
William Schmidt has asked, are there any suggestions in getting state funding with restrictions on lobbying, such as, where LSC or LITC, et cetera. And I think what's really important is, although you may not be able to be going up to the Hill, that's where, as with Keith's example, you have someone like, John Warren with the enrolled agents, who is really doing most of the connections. And then if the Hill is, the legislators are reaching out to you to ask you for questions or for expert testimony, or inviting you to testify before a public hearing on the appropriation, then that becomes a very different thing. And so one thing would be to really think about whether it's your board or your pro bono panel, that, there are people on your pro bono panel that might be doing lobbying on a regular basis, or their firm might, and you could talk to them whether they would be interested in taking up the charge. I mean, having that conversation isn't lobbying, it's just a conversation. And you have to do it artfully, but that's a perfectly legitimate thing. And if your board member speaking in their personal capacity, as opposed to a member of the board, they have to make that really clear, but that's a First Amendment issue. So I think there are ways that you can do it. It requires care and it might take a little bit more time, but I think just saying, well, there's a lobbying restriction and I can't do it is just, you're selling yourself short.
I
Yeah.
would fully agree. Sorry, Anna, go ahead. Yeah.
Oh, no, I exactly. I fully agree with what Nina said. And we have a agency-wide compliance officer who's very well versed on the intricacies of the LSC restrictions. And I think that it's absolutely worth pursuing with care, with the help of a compliance officer. And it's the restriction is just a restriction on certain ways of requesting funding. So sorry, David.
No, that was great. Yeah, for sure, that getting an expert that understands what the distinctions are, because there's not a deadpan, you cannot lobby rule. There's flexibility there and there's creativity that can be used. If you have a local ACLU, speak to them about how they go about splitting their funding so that they're not overstepping, using funding that's not allowed to be used for lobbying purposes. There's many ways of getting around, I wouldn't say getting around, but working within the rules to be able to get what you need to help low-income taxpayers. Don't just accept that you cannot do it. That's not the answer. The answer is you may need a creative way of doing it. So.
I think Anna brings up the differences that exist between different types of clinics. So a legal services corporation clinic, like the one that Anna works in, is going to have more rules that are imposed on you in terms of things that you can do or must do as you move forward than an academic clinic would have, or an independent clinic like David's would have. But we tried at Harvard. And we were working with GBLS, which is a more restricted clinic. Our goal is to be providing information rather than to be pushing people to a certain result, and that seemed to work.
Thanks, William.
And part of, what the center is trying to do by doing the survey and coming up with model legislation is that then you don't have to do the drafting. You can take that and say, here's something that makes sense or that others are doing. And that is certainly something that the center would be more than happy to do some heavy lifting in the conversations and things. If members of your General Assembly are interested in that, we can give them a view to what's being done around the country and make suggestions, because we're not lobbying for our funding, and so that becomes, it is information providing, but we aren't subject to, other than the general 501c3, restrictions. And there are ways of communicating that get information to the right sources.
Any other questions from the chat?
I would point out that with the relationships that we developed in the process of getting the funding have been helpful to us in other ways. We had in Massachusetts, they do not adopt automatically changes to the Internal Revenue Code. So we ran into the problem that they had never adopted the innocent spouse provision changes in 1998. So we had clients who we were obtaining innocent spouse relief for under the federal statute, but who still owed the state of Massachusetts because we were getting them F relief, and there was no F relief in the state statute. So again, working with the EAs and working with the state, the MADOR, we were able to change the Massachusetts state statute on innocent spouse to have it mirror the federal statute. We actually had a client who benefited from that immediately after we got it adopted. But the relationships that you develop, that you may have already developed in doing something in the state, or that you may develop through the process of seeking grant funding, could be helpful to you in other ways than just direct, or helpful to your clients in other ways than just funding. So it can be important to find people at the legislature who know what your expertise is and can call on that expertise to help to craft legislation that will be beneficial to your clients in ways that would be very difficult for you to achieve through litigation.
Yeah, that is very helpful to them to have an expert that's seeing it on a regular basis. We do have another question. Do any of the LITCs represented here charge client nominal fees for services? The Community Tax Law Project does not. I don't think any of the others do.
We don't.
However, it does not.
Nina, any comment on that one?
You know, I will only say that when the statute crafted was nominal fees, that at that point, the Center for Taxpayer Rights had considered charging 25. We had a different structure in that we were saying it would be totally free for 125% federal poverty level, because that was the legal aid cutoff at the time, and then $25 for just representation to 125% to 250. And then that just became so annoying. It was like, I just don't even want to bother with it. And it was more, we were trying to make sure that people, because we did get some pushback when we first formed the clinic in 1992, you know, that there was this concept that people should pay for something. But once people got very used to, you know, really started seeing the cases, they were like, oh, forget about this. So nominal is really nominal. And you will find that if you do nominal, that you're spending more administrative stuff dealing with the money and paying employee time than anything else. I mean, folks really can't afford it. So you're just spending your own money to collect it, is my personal opinion and my experience.
Yeah, to have that extra retail wrinkle and the possibility of getting audited for your 501c3 status, if that's what you're under, that just doesn't seem worth it for the $25 or whatever it is. Well, I think that brings us to 1 o'clock. So thank you to all our panelists. This is very informative. And there were some materials that you will receive as a participant that have specific language from the statutes that they had. And thanks for having us.
Well, thank you, David, for doing the moderation and all of our guests. I think you were terrific panelists, and thank you for tolerating my interruptions. But, you know, I can't be silent about this program. So now we're going to go to another program that I also can't be silent about, and we're about to move the tax cat, who's sitting on my notes for that program. This panel is going to be on taxpayer advocate offices, or what they're called in the various states. And my panelists are Cody Trudell, who is a proud lifelong Oregonian, and she has more than 19 years of public civil service. And in 2021, she was appointed Oregon's first taxpayer advocate in the Oregon Department of Revenue. And as taxpayer advocate, she works to be the voice and resource for Oregon's taxpayers. And what she didn't put in her intro was that she was actually recruited into the Department of Revenue to work on the legislation for that the Oregon legislature ultimately passed, creating the office. And she had no background in tax and did a fabulous job working on that legislation. And then, of course, she was the natural pick for being the first taxpayer advocate in Oregon. We next have Gary Gray, who's the Florida taxpayer advocate, and Gary was appointed to his current position on January 1st, 2022. He is a proud Florida State University graduate and says, "Go Noles." And he worked with the Florida Department of Revenue for about 40 years prior to his appointment, and says he was 11 years old when he started. He held various positions within the department, including about 25 years with the department's appeals process, which is a really good predecessor job, I think, for the taxpayer advocate position. And prior to that appointment, he was in charge of the Taxpayer Relations Department in the department or for the department. So that's also another good predecessor job. Then we have Brenda Voigt, and Brenda has been with the California Franchise Tax Board for more than 30 years. And for most of her career, she worked in the audit division, most recently as a program manager. She also served as the technical assistant to prior taxpayer rights advocates, so she's got lots of experience there, and as a public affairs officer, so she's hearing constantly from people who are talking about tax. Each year, Brenda and her team successfully resolved hundreds of taxpayer state tax issues, ensure taxpayers are given proper protection under the Taxpayer Bill of Rights, and educate taxpayers and tax professionals about their rights and responsibilities. Now, we thought we would do this as more of a conversation, just like the last panel, but we do have on our materials and video page the statutory authority for each of these offices, and also each have created a PowerPoint slide deck so that you can see some of the data and the important points about each of the offices, and you can reference them. And after this program, today, we're going to make that page public on our website, so you don't have to have the special link. You'll find it under the section for Reimagining State Taxpayer Rights with all the videos and all the materials. But we wanted to put it out there so that you can look at the language. And again, the center will be working up some draft of some model legislation. So I think the first question I want to do, which will just be really basic, which is just please describe the history of your office, how it came about. Is the authority legislative or administrative? Meaning that is there a statute that describes what your office is supposed to do? So I don't know who wants to go first, but someone can.
This is Gary Gray. Thank you for having me. I'll go first, and I'm Florida's Taxpayer Advocate. Again, I was appointed in just the first of this year and love this job, and I really enjoy working with taxpayers. The position of Florida's Taxpayer Advocate was created in 1992. This is a position under Florida law. It was created under section 20.13 of the Florida statutes. And the reporting structure is interesting. I actually report to Melinda Miguel. She is the Chief Inspector General of Florida, and she reports directly to the Governor Ron DeSantis in Florida. But for administrative purposes, I report to the Executive Director of the Florida Department of Revenue. His name is Dr. Jim Zingali. And I've worked with Dr. Jim Zingali for many, many years. We have a very good working relationship. And one of the benefits of working with Dr. Zingali is he and I have known each other a long time. He doesn't tell me what to do. He trusts me. He relies on me. He refers cases to me, but he never tells me what to do or how to handle a case.
I'm happy to chime in since a lot of what Gary described is very similar for me. So October marked my 1-year mark as the taxpayer advocate. And as Nina so politely described, I did get recruited to come look at potential legislation for the department. They had a new director, Director Einholt, and she had heard about this taxpayer advocacy type of approach or ombudsman approach. And she was genuinely curious why Oregon did not have one. So unlike Gary, we didn't have anything going back to the 90s, but Oregon did pass Taxpayer Bill of Rights, just no taxpayer advocate. So it's a little bit like, well, who's gonna oversee those rights? And that's kind of what we experienced when I was doing the research, that was the question of a lot of people. So fortunately and very serendipitously there was a legislator at the time that had heard about taxpayer advocacy as well and had a constituent that was interested in it. So it was perfect timing. I was already out there trying to do the research to find out how something like this could work for Oregon and put forward some recommendations. And when the bill basically came about, so many people hopped on board. And so that's been a huge piece in this first year, is maintaining those partnerships to make sure that people like low-income tax clinics that we just heard about get the benefits of this office as well. Very important that the internal partners are on the same page as well. So I do a lot of that work, that outreach and networking and engagement. So real quick, like Gary, I also just report to the director of the Department of Revenue. And also like Gary, she understands the utmost importance of keeping my position very neutral, so that taxpayers can feel that they can come to me and know that I will give them a fair shake. So I brief her and give her feedback and updates, but like Gary, I would say she's not telling me how to be influenced or to act in other ways. And so we really appreciate that we were able to get that bill codified. And I think the bill pretty clearly spells out my responsibilities and my duties. So I encourage you all to look at those materials if you're interested further.
Brenda?
Well, I want to say good morning because I'm over here in California, but I'll say good day. We have had a Taxpayer Bill of Rights and a Taxpayer Advocate since 1988. So we are such a large taxing authority in the state of California that it was very important for us to be able to have an advocate for the taxpayers. So we were created by the legislature. We have our own statute. We're required to help taxpayers resolve issues when they can't do it through our normal communication channels. And what I mean by those is if they're working on an audit, if they can't deal with the audit department or the management there, they can reach out to us and we can help facilitate a better conversation. Or if they're in collections and the collector and the taxpayer, the tax representative are having a disagreement, we can come on in and help facilitate better conversations. What we try to do is facilitate those conversations. It's very rare that my team will actually take ownership of an issue because we found it's better to have those subject matter experts in the program areas weigh in on what's being done. And it also gives them an opportunity to understand what some of the concerns are that are being raised by the tax practitioner and the taxpayer community. So it really helps them to improve the services that they do. In '97, we, in response to federal changes that were made to the taxpayer rights laws, we provided additional protections to be more in line with what the federal taxpayer advocate was doing. And then in 1999, we enhanced our Taxpayer Bill of Rights to give the advocate authority to provide relief for penalties or interest or even additional tax when the taxpayer made an error and there's no other relief available through our normal reasonable cause or some of our other provisions that are available. We've used it when we found that we were not providing the proper computation for taxpayers who are in our 1% additional tax. We found that there was a situation that wasn't providing the proper amount of tax, and we were able to provide relief through this provision. So it's just a very nice safety net. I work very closely with our senior legal team and to make sure that what we are doing is in line with the authority that we've been given. We also have the responsibility written into the statute that we will provide education and outreach, and that we will also identify systemic issues and report those to within our area. And then we also have the responsibility to do a report on non-compliance that we recognize, and we report that to our legislature every year. So that's a really big overview of the role and responsibilities that my team and I have.
So I want to come back to that extraordinary provision of your statute that you can do an abatement, that you yourself can do the abatement, because in many instances, including the National Taxpayer Advocate, excuse me, you did not have the authority to abate that yourself. You had to get the agency to. So that's really remarkable. And it looks like you can, you can abate penalties, fees, addition to tax, or interest assessed if it's attributable to any of the following: erroneous action or erroneous inaction by the board in processing documents filed or payments made by taxpayers. Can you only imagine what it would be like with the economic impact, the pandemic and the IRS backlog, if that were in place? Erroneous written advice that doesn't qualify for relief under other provisions. And then the other thing is that and then unreasonable delay caused by the board. And that's interesting. Like, what is unreasonable delay? And then there's also in the statute saying that no part of that error or delay can be attributed to the taxpayer.
Correct. And that's really the most difficult thing to be able to establish, is that it was truly not on the part of the taxpayer. But most of the time that's pretty easy if we have been documenting our records and keeping good audit notes or keeping good collection notes. One of the things that we are able to offer, and not through this provision, is we've had a lot of turnover in our staffing, and sometimes a case will get opened by one person and then it will sit until it's assigned by another. So we've been able to step in and provide relief for interest for that time period when it was sitting before the assignment was remade. And unfortunately, I think that's something that a lot of agencies and tax professionals are really facing, is that we had a very large influx of those that were interested in accounting and taxation years ago, and now we're finding that the interest just isn't really as strong as it used to be. So being able to recruit and get people on in has been one of our challenges. So we're doing a lot of things to work with that, but sometimes that delay can cause interest to accrue, and we want to be able to make sure that they're not getting penalized for something that they did not cause.
I think every clinician on this call is going, oh my gosh, that's amazing. And I think I can guarantee that that provision is going to be in the model statute. Just, it's so important. Years ago, I made a legislative recommendation to the IRS that we issue apology payments up to a certain amount, pretty much in the same conditions, just some recognition. It's not to make the taxpayer whole, but it's some recognition that they did experience some kind of harm. So, because of the delay. That's really fascinating. So, I know we've talked about the relationship a little bit with your supervisor. So, maybe, there's always the question, you're inside the agency, even though, Gary, you report to the Inspector General. Do you find that a conflict? Are there times where, how do you manage that if you really have a disagreement?
So even though I report to the Inspector General, I don't speak with her on a daily basis. I speak with, I talk with Dr. Zingale on a daily basis. But my relationship with the department is different than California, in that I don't have the authority to compromise tax, penalty, or interest. What I do is I try to become the voice of the taxpayer, to share their case and to provide an understanding that maybe the department didn't have about the taxpayer's case with the department. And I also become the voice of the department. Sometimes taxpayers don't fully understand why the department made a decision that they have made. And so I try to explain it to them. And One of the things that Brenda mentioned was that she can help with negotiating a compromise of the interest due to delays by the department and when it's no fault of the taxpayer. And I can certainly do that as well. But work closely with the department, auditors and collectors in trying to negotiate the taxpayer's position. A lot of times it's cases where a taxpayer didn't file the return on time and they're looking for a compromise of the penalty. A lot of times I can assist in that area. A lot of times taxpayers miss their protest time frame or their appeal rights. And Florida doesn't have the authority, or the Department of Revenue doesn't have the authority to reopen an audit after protest rights have expired. And so what we did last year during the legislative session is to propose some language that would grant the department with some limited opportunities to grant taxpayers their appeal rights. Sometimes taxpayers get sick. Sometimes there's death in the taxpayer's family or the death of the taxpayer. So through no fault of their own, we are trying to find ways of granting taxpayer appeal rights in those cases where they have lost their rights. And so we're proposing that this next legislative session. So
that's really important. And I think when we were having our planning call, I mentioned that the Supreme Court had just ruled this year, the United States Supreme Court, in a federal tax case, that the 30-day deadline for filing a petition in the United States Tax Court for a collection, review of collection procedures was not jurisdictional, and the taxpayer could come in and show why they missed the deadline. It didn't mean that they would get their chance, but if they had it's a high bar to show why you couldn't do it, but at least it gave you the opportunity. And I think that's really, from a fairness point of view, that just lets taxpayers feel like they're being heard, even if the answer is, well, it's not a good enough excuse. At least they got to say it.
Right, good point.
That's really interesting. We'll follow that, whether you get that through. That's very interesting.
I will let you all know for sure.
Thank you. Yeah. So, Cody, do you have anything to add to your relationship or things like that?
Yeah, I have to compliment you, Nina. You gave me the best language when I first talked to you when I was researching this project that I use all the time when I try to describe to people. I say, Nina described it as being housed within agency. So that's what I always envision it as. They're letting me live in their house. And I get along with them and do my best, as you would with any roommates. But like I mentioned earlier, trying to maintain that neutrality is really important. We do have authority in our bill, and this was why anybody thinking of doing legislation, again, try to get those community partners on board, outside groups that might benefit, like the low-income tax clinics, whomever, to work with you, because it was through external partners that they went to the legislator and said, can we help make sure that we add two really important components to this legislation, which would be that there is a reporting mechanism directly by the taxpayer advocate to the legislature. So I do that every other year. And then the second piece that they really wanted to get in there as well to up the neutrality and the guarantees to taxpayers was that I would have an order authority. So it's not nearly as in-depth as California. I know some of the groups really did look at California's and really hoped for that. But we were pretty pleased. Me at the time not being in the role, I was very pleased because that's what the research has said was the best practice was. If you can get it codified, try to get some kind of order authority. But I would say I'm much more like Gary in my first year, that so far, the agency just and Nina shared this a lot to me too, and I heard it from other people that have been in the state taxpayer advocates, which is just the agency knowing you have that authority encourages them to work with you. So I'm a lot like Gary, where we've been like, look, this was significantly taking too long. They probably shouldn't have been penalized because it was kind of on us, and then they're willing to just work with me so that they don't have to get to that point.
Yeah, so maybe what we should do is go to the question of the orders. You know, California has some specific requirements. You definitely have specific requirements to do the orders. The one thing I noted, which really caused problems in my office, which your language also picks up, is that when you issue an order, you know, the deputy commissioner or the commissioner can rescind or modify it. And the problem was, well, if the deputy commissioner modifies it, then why am I under the role of the deputy commissioner, particularly if I'm reporting to the commissioner? Can't I elevate it to the commissioner for one more shot? And we have tried very hard to get that into the procedures. And at this point, it's still not in the procedures. It's a little bit more complicated, I think, with the IRS because the commissioner is a political appointee as opposed to a career official, where the deputy is a career official. So my going around it was, you know, when I would meet with a commissioner to just say, okay, I'm not going to talk to you about this case, but let me tell you about this issue that is before the deputy commissioner that I've entered an order on. I'm not going to tell you the taxpayer's name, but I'm going to tell you what the issue is. And I'm going to keep bringing it up to you until we get some resolution, even, you know, but that challenge of not having an appeal right above, you know, the deputy commissioner, you know, was really a struggle for me. You know, I've struggled with that. But on the other hand, they want to, you know, usually the deputy's the one that's the most involved in the, you know, in the details of the job. So what about you, Brendan, Gary, and your order? Or, you know, and in some statutes, it says you can stay action, you know, you can stop something happening while you're working on that. So let's talk about that a bit, like your powers in that regard.
Okay, so yes, my position, not me personally, but my position does have the authority to issue a stay action on behalf of a taxpayer who is about to suffer some irreparable loss as a result of the action by the department. I've never issued one. I believe my predecessors may have issued one or two previously in the years. I don't actually anticipate that I would ever have to issue one, because I have such a good working relationship with the department. The department works really well with taxpayers already in most cases. But yeah, this position does have the authority to issue an action to prevent the department from doing something, some collection action, like maybe freezing a bank account or filing a lien in cases where it was totally inappropriate. So yes, the Department of Revenue, or my position in Florida, does have that authority.
It's nice to have that in your pocket. We always used
Yes,
to
ma'am.
say that the threat of issuing a taxpayer assistance order was actually very highly effective.
Certainly.
You know.
Yeah, that's something that my team and I designated another area. We have an executive and advocate service team who works directly with Stelby Stanislaus, our director, and any elected officials, and also our confidential accounts for taxpayers that may have an adversarial relationship with the franchise tax board or their employees. But one of the things that we offer very frequently is we put a hold on the account, is what we call it. If there's going to be an economic hardship, if we're going to be garnishing wages or taking money from accounts or issuing liens, we want to be able to put a hold on that account so that we can come on in and have a conversation. Because we find that if we can have those conversations, get somebody into an installment agreement, perfect an installment agreement, or figure out if there was something that was critical that we did not know about, then we want to have an opportunity to look at that and make sure that we are going after the proper amount of tax, and that the actions that we are taking are within the statute. Sometimes ships cross in the night where somebody makes a payment and then we issue one of our letters that says we never got your payment. And so just being able to put a hold on an account, look at that and make sure that we're not going to take the next step in our ability to collect on something has been very beneficial, and it's something that we offer daily to taxpayers. With our audit departments, they're so very good at what they do. It's very rare that we will step in, but when we do step in, if it has been because somebody hasn't made the date for a protest or an appeal, what we can do is we can do a courtesy review. And I've had some of our teams look at new information that comes on in just to see if the proper amount of tax would be changed based on that information. And we can, they can do an abatement, which would be reducing the tax, even though the administrative rights have not been pursued. But in California, there's always the ability to pay, which then would allow you to file a claim for refund, which in turn allows you to reinstate all of your administrative rights. So sometimes that's the avenue that will encourage taxpayers to go if we're not able to work anything behind the scenes.
Right.
Brenda, you make some really good points there. And what I talked about before was the formal type of stay action. Much like what you have in California, I also have here in Florida. I can ask the department to suspend collections while I work with a taxpayer and work with the department, both in the collections level and the audit level. So that was really good points that you made. Thank you.
Yeah, I think well, I know we had, agreements, and it was in the Internal Revenue Manual that when we accepted a case and it showed up on the system, then that put a collection stay on the IRS commencing certain things. Now, if there was already collection going on, then we needed to intervene. And, part of the case might have been, you need to release this levy because the taxpayer can't pay their basic living expenses. But to get that done, we had to gather financial documents and things like that and submit it over, but we could at least stop anything. That marker stopped anything that was about to happen on the systems. Yeah. Which was always very helpful. And it was also very helpful to put the marker in. So, anybody touching that case would see that we were involved and maybe think twice before doing something that escalated without checking with us. Cody, what about you in your work?
I would say that I am very fortunate as well that the department already does a really phenomenal job of acknowledging individuals that are already kind of in a place of struggle, or if their action is in part because of the department's error. So usually they're really great. If I hear of anything related remotely to a hardship, they're almost always right in agreement too, that they can put a hold on it, and we'll work through it and see what we can do. I think the biggest thing that I have been surprised by, that I think the position has really done versus what the department did, is just that a lot of the taxpayers reach out to me because they're intimidated, they're embarrassed. They don't like the idea of calling the 1-800 number. They're just really scared. So when we say voice of the taxpayers, I was always in my head envisioning this of like that person that's going to speak up in meetings and say, well, did you think about the taxpayer this way? And so this year it's been a real revelation to me, like, no, literally I am their voice a lot, to go and talk to that unit and say, can you put a hold on this? And then I go back and tell the taxpayer, they're going to contact you. This is the person's name. They're going to be friendly. They're going to approach you. And then there's just so much relief that comes through that. So that's what I'd add to, is where that helps.
It's really interesting. The one very early on when I was National Taxpayer Advocate, we did a nationwide survey of taxpayers who looked eligible for our assistance, which was anyone that had a tax problem within the last 2 years. And we surveyed nationwide the group of these taxpayers to identify like who it was going to be that might be needed our services. And, you know, everybody was thinking, well, it'd be low income taxpayers, but it turned out to be, you know, everybody needed our services. But the survey firm also did a really interesting, what they called psychographic analysis. They asked certain questions, and they found that, you know, there was a group of taxpayers who were IRS accepting, which meant that if they got a notice from the IRS, they'd call the IRS. You know, they'd pick up the phone, and that gave the IRS an opportunity to try to at least get the information it needed, work through the problem. There was a group that was IRS distrustful. They still called the IRS. They yelled at the IRS. They were angry at the IRS, but still you had an opportunity, you know, if you could get through to that person after a while, you had them on the phone and you could get some information that you needed to maybe make the problem go away. But the group that was the most common in the taxpayers who really needed our help were taxpayers who were intimidated by the IRS, and they never called. And so you never had the opportunity to find out what was really going on. And then the agency just went on by default. If you don't respond, then it means, you know, you're either a bad actor or you agree that we got it right or whatever. And then things go downhill quickly from there, which really told us something about how we had to talk to taxpayers, how we had to advertise ourselves, you know, to communicate to them. And, you know, it led to the theme of, you know, the worst thing you can do is nothing at all. Like, that's the worst thing. Do not, you know, be an ostrich. And so it was just so telling, that finding. It was, and it's interesting to hear you, you know, articulate that you're seeing that too. I think that's a key role, just to build trust. So we talked a little bit about that you all have in some version, reporting requirements. So maybe we should talk about the reports and what you've put in them and to whom they go and how frequently. Cody, you said it was once every 2 years, I think. Was that right?
Yeah, and mine, so I'll be coming up, it works out that it's every odd year, and it will go to one of the revenue committees or finance committees, I'm sure. And it includes that they want an update on the status in the operations of the office. So I built in performance metrics right off the get-go. So, you know, those basic things, and if you want to look at my slides, I have some of them covered there, just like how many, what types, were people satisfied overall, what's their experience. Then I'm also supposed to identify barriers of inequitable treatment or unfair treatment and raise those concerns. And then lastly, I can talk about recommendations. So I think that's where a lot of these things that the department itself can't fix, but maybe there's legislation that can fix it. That's going to be my intention for that.
That's really great. Brenda?
So we have an official report that is due to the legislature each year, January 15th, like I told you before, and to identify areas of non-compliance. So it's pretty structured. What are we doing in our collections areas? What are we seeing in our audit areas? And what are we seeing in our legal department? So it's kind of an informational return, but there's also other ways that the advocate's office and the advocate themselves have an opportunity to share concerns. We have a standing Taxpayer Bill of Rights meeting each year. It's coming up in December. We have it during our quarterly board members meetings. So that gives tax practitioners, taxpayers an opportunity to come forward with concerns so they can be voiced before our board. The Franchise Tax Board answers to the state controller, also has a representative from our Board of Equalization and our Department of Finance. So that's who we work most closely with in trying to share ideas or share ways that we think we can make our systems work more taxpayer friendly to provide better services. I know everybody's probably heard of our MyFTB account. So we were able to offer that to our board. Board was able to approve that. We were able to get funding for it. And it's a way to provide services to our tax-paying community. So Although I don't have a voice necessarily in the required report, I have a voice when it comes to my monthly meetings with the director, Selby Stanislaus, my quarterly meetings with our governance council, and my annual meeting with the franchise tax board that we report to, which is kind of confusing because there are overseers and we're the franchise tax board administrate that. So it's really all about making sure that we have really good relationships with all involved. Relationships with taxpayer, the tax practitioner community, so I can hear what their concerns are. I can work with them to identify. We also have a tax trade media community that's very strong and active in California. So I have a trade media liaison, and they've been really generous about allowing us to look at their communication boards and be able to see, is there something that's going on in the conversations that maybe we should be aware of. For example, this week, nobody could get through to our dedicated tax practitioner line. Didn't know what was going on, gave us an opportunity to look into it. We discovered what was going on and got to get that resolved again. So there's a lot of relationship building and communicating that way versus just structured reports that we're mandated to give.
So Gary, you actually in your statute, it says very specifically before January of each year, you're going to furnish to the governor, the president of the Senate, the speaker of the House of Representatives, and the chief inspector general, a report that includes a whole bunch of stuff, including making administrative and legislative recommendations. So how does that work? And what are some of those recommendations administrative? Has there been anything that's really crept out at you or became like, this is my cause, we've got to do this? I mean, you mentioned, several things earlier, but let's talk about your report, because that looks like a very strong report.
It is, and this will be my first report, of course. There are 4 prior reports to this one, so this will be the 5th report by this office, and I'm just about finished, and our reports are posted on my website, and so all of y'all can go in and see all the prior reports. Mine will be posted soon, so you have a chance to see mine as well. Yes, it's a very structured report. What we do, what I'm doing, come following the predecessors' reports, although some of my own ideas and thoughts on here. The first part of the report talks about the statistics for the year, how many contacts the office has received, and what the contacts were, what type of tax issues there were. Sales and use tax, of course, is our largest tax, and so most of the contacts we receive is for sales and use tax. Some of the issues that were raised by my predecessors include, let's see here. One of them is adding a reference to the Taxpayer Bill of Rights in all of the documents that are that the department sends out to taxpayers. That's one of them that we're working on. Another one is, let's see here. So another one was, the advocate before me didn't think the department was using their compromise authority properly in the collections process. For example, a taxpayer might request a compromise of their penalty, and the collector that they're working with wasn't comfortable making the compromise themselves, and so they went above. They went ahead and talked to the supervisor to ask for assistance in making that determination. That's one. Let's see. Another one was, prior to this year, the advocate's office was overly burdened with IRS questions. We don't have a state income tax here in Florida, but a lot of our contacts, matter of fact, 1/3 of all contacts that we receive are related to IRS issues. a citizen of Florida may call us or email us about, I sent in my federal tax return 6 months ago and I haven't heard anything. Well, we can't do anything about that. And so we refer them to the IRS Taxpayer Advocates Office or local service center. But what we've done on our website is to tell taxpayers that we can't help them with that and they need to contact the IRS. But my office is really an advocate for any taxpayer for any issue. And so we will gladly help them and refer them to the IRS. One of the new issues that I have come up with this year is where is it here? I feel like sometimes an auditor and a taxpayer don't communicate effectively, or there isn't enough effort by an auditor to communicate everything that's going on with a taxpayer. From the inception of the audit to the creation of the work papers to requests for documents. And so I'm asking the department to enhance or look for opportunities for the auditor to make sure that the communications with the taxpayer and themselves is what it's supposed to be. So those are a couple of the things that I'm working on.
What about the other of you? What systemic issues are you working on in that regard?
So with respect to the auditor and a taxpayer?
Well, I think you identified that as an issue. I was thinking maybe Cody and Brenda could say,
okay,
are they
sorry.
identifying other
Oh,
issues?
my bad, sorry.
Yeah, because you answered that one.
Yeah, so I also want to chime in. I am right there with you, Gary. So our fourth most populated question is IRS related question. So
that's interesting, Cody. It really is.
So we do the same thing. We do a lot of, well, you actually have to call the IRS. Sorry, we can't help you. Yeah, systemic issues. One of the things we're really proud of is I should mention the bill. We were really fortunate. They passed the backing of my position as the taxpayer advocate. And then they funded 2 additional positions for this inaugural year. And so I asked to have one of those positions be a research analyst for. So my research analyst is probably the biggest person at helping look at these systemic issues with me. So one of the issues as an example, and I was really excited because I heard somebody else mention this in the last Zoom get together that we had the other week around return mail. So we're looking at some recommendations around, I guess what I should say, and I would encourage anybody looking at taxpayer advocacy that's been really helpful for us, is Oregon has really always been very dedicated to diversity and equity and inclusion. And so when I came in as taxpayer advocate, I wanted to really make sure we owned that and help teach the department a lot of those DEI issues. And because so much DEI is just human resource related and employee related. So we've also looked at a lot of systemic issues within agency when they come to us and they'll say, hey, so like right now is a great example. We have an auditor that started a question around which pronouns to use when they're documenting a case. So those are some other things that we use. And then I'll lastly add, I think that having that DEI piece is also been able to help us separate the work that internal audits does, our own internal auditors that are investigating issues. So they've partnered with us. We have a new unit standing up that's going to look at risk as well. And so that really helps articulate, well, if it's got maybe some DEI systemic issues to taxpayers, maybe that's better suited for the taxpayer advocate to look at.
Brenda, what about you?
So we don't have anything that pops into my head right now as being systemic. One of our biggest issues is we've been pushing a lot of social programs here in California through our tax returns. And what that has done is it's created a responsibility for taxpayers to file tax returns in order to receive those benefits, which has caused a lot of questions to be called in, and people are using every single resource that they possibly can. They go to our website, and if they call just every single number and leave their name and want to know where their stimulus payment is or where their check is. So what that has done is it's caused a backlog of us being able to really answer the questions for tax practitioners and taxpayers relating to anything other than that status. So that's been something very difficult to overcome, but we're keeping our fingers crossed that in this upcoming filing season, we will have all of those issued and we will back to our normal routine. But one thing we put in place to help us with identifying systemic issues is we took the federal SAM, systemic issue
Systemic advocacy management system.
Thank you. And then the prior advocate was named Steve Sims, so he changed it to Systemic Issues Management Systems. So we call it SIMS, so he will live on forever with us. But what it is it's an opportunity for a taxpayer or tax professional to let us know that they think that there's a systemic issue. Something's not being explained well in our instructions, or there's a computation, or there's answers that they're getting that may not be correct. So they have an opportunity to go online and report that to us. We as a team work on it to determine, do we have enough information to get an answer, or do we need to reach out to the program areas and work with their subject matter experts to get an answer? And just this year, I expanded it because we found that there were a lot of former FTB employees that were using their former colleagues to try to get answers to some of their questions. And the concern that we had is maybe that former colleague didn't have the most current and vetted information. So we've expanded the use of our systemic issues management system for any general questions that may not be. We have an Ask a Legal Expert portal that people can use, but this is more for general. So what our role and responsibility is again, we will coordinate the answer, make sure it's vetted, and then provide it to the tax professional or taxpayer who's asking it. We just found that having that systemic issues management system has just been a very good tool for us to be able to use to identify anything that we may not be aware of. I know that everyone at FTB is doing their absolute best to try to anticipate the needs of our taxpayers and our taxpayer community, but we're looking at legislation and we're within the walls of FTB. So sometimes our good intentions actually turn out to have a different impact than anticipated when you're actually applying the law or following the form. So it's a very good tool that we're using to help identify those and to be able to resolve those quickly.
So I haven't asked how large your offices are. Like, how many employees do you have, Brenda, on your staff?
So we have all throughout California. We have a district office in Manhattan. We have a district office in Chicago, and we have a district office in Houston because we have a lot of corporations that are doing business both within and out of California. So on staff, we have almost 6,000.
Okay. And Cody?
Just my 3. We are
Well, the 6,000's FTB as a whole.
What about your office?
For my small yet mighty team, there's 11 of us.
That's better, because I was going to go, that's pretty impressive. That's larger than the taxpayer advocate in the IRS. So that's good. It's making Cody have like a.
We're all advocates for taxpayers, right?
I like that.
So Cody is 3. Gary, how about you?
So Cody, I'm right there with you. It's me and 2 others.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So do you ever, when you get the calls about the IRS, do you refer them to the local taxpayer advocates, the IRS local taxpayer advocates, just give them that information out?
Yeah, we do all the time. And I just had the pleasure of meeting the current federal taxpayer advocate, Erin, and she really wanted to partner with California and see if they could provide information on their website on how to get in contact with our state taxpayer advocate, and us vice versa, how we can provide information for them, because they find that there's a lot of state issue only questions that are being asked at the federal level also, and they would like to really be able to get those taxpayers into the right state agency. And she thought that maybe just getting them over to the taxpayer advocate department, we could then be able to facilitate that. So that's a conversation yet to have, but I think it's really going to be very helpful to be able to partner in that way.
Okay, so my final question to you all is, and it's not meant to be a difficult question, but just, is there anything that you would like to have in your authority that you don't have already? I always wanted to have my own counsel. We kind of worked that out by having someone within the Office of Chief Counsel be dedicated to my office, who could both advise me directly, but they still reported to the chief counsel of the IRS. The other one was, which I was never successful getting, which was the amicus brief authority, to be able to file in cases on appeal, sort of a taxpayer rights perspective, which sometimes, in litigation, both the government and the taxpayer weren't raising this issue, but you're looking at this case and you're going, oh my gosh, there's such a rights issue here that you need my voice in there, the taxpayer advocate's voice, to say, wait a minute, folks, you also need to consider this. So is there anything like that, or even something very basic, other than, yes, we all want more employees, that you would like to have?
I can take this one first. So one thing that I think has been the most difficult in this first year is when a lot of the problem actually exists with a financial institution like a bank or credit union. I think that even so, when I was doing this research, some of the benefits of having like an ombudsman's role in the governor's office would help you work with other agencies. So I went ahead and I've worked very hard to work with other agencies just on my own, like Treasury in our state and the Department of Human Services for certain things as well, and employment, etc. But it occurs to me, there are some taxpayers, when I start hearing from them, I'm like, wow, even if I intervene right now to get the bank to undo a fraudulent check claim, to get the bank to act, that's a really hard thing that you have to tell taxpayers. We can do everything we can and keep advocating for you, but the financial institution, that's happened more than a few times this year, and that's very frustrating.
Interesting.
Yeah, that's a good point, Cody. So sometimes the department and I, we disagree, and I feel strongly about a case. And those are the times that I wish that I had the authority that I could tell the department what to do, to compromise that penalty, or to negotiate a better payment plan with a taxpayer. Sometimes a taxpayer, they're giving everything that they can based upon what my analysis is of their financials, and I don't think the taxpayer can pay any more per month than they are, and the department doesn't listen. And I'd like to tell the department, okay, the taxpayer can only pay $500 a month, and that's it, and that's what you have to do. Right. And I sometimes I would like to have that authority. I really would.
Yeah, it's really hard,
Yeah.
It's really hard. Brenda?
Well, I'm spoiled. We've had 30 years to work out and create a very smooth road. So I have legal counsel that I can go to that's within FTB. We can have those strong, hard conversations. I also have bureau directors within our filing division, within our collections division, and I can have those hard conversations with them. And because we've had 30 years of working towards making sure that we're giving the best customer service that we possibly can, those conversations are few and far between, but when they are had, there's a mutual respect for what I'm bringing up as a concern and what their viewpoint is. And so the discussions in the past were more adversarial that way, but we've been really working on relationships so that we can have those difficult conversations and have them more productive and meaningful. So I'm really spoiled. I have some very amazing people who are very receptive to looking at things a different way, or bringing in someone else who can help them to see what I'm trying to say and why I'm trying to say it. And that's been really helpful in making sure that we are doing the right thing. Oftentimes, just because we can doesn't mean we should in every single situation. So having those conversations with people who are the decision makers within the Franchise Tax Board is a privilege, because I know that there's other agencies within California that don't have those relationships, and the taxpayer's voice isn't actually being heard. So
I think that's really important, that sort of goes back to the reporting structure. To whom do you report? So you actually can go to those people who are heads of office. You know, all the tax agencies are very hierarchical. And so, you know, when you go in and you say, look, I'm a direct report, you don't have to say it. You know, they know you're a direct report to the commissioner, you're a direct report to whomever. They know that they're going to have to at least grudgingly pay attention to you. And maybe when you make the points, they go, okay, you just said something that I hadn't thought about. And that's really helpful. This has been a great session. I want to see if anybody on the call has questions that they want to ask. I haven't seen anything in the chat so far. But I think this has been terrific. And Anna, do you have a question that you want to ask?
I do, yes. I think, Gary, you sort of mentioned this, and I think I know the answer for California, but I'm just curious, do you all as advocates, like, does your jurisdiction, I guess, cover different types of tax? I mean, I know there's no income tax in Florida, but you know, in California, are you limited to only those taxes sort of administered by the Franchise Tax Board? What do you cover, I guess, is my...
Yeah, in Florida, you have the Department of Revenue has the child support enforcement, correct? So do you cover
right.
that?
So yeah, I cover business taxes. That's my role: sales tax, corporate income tax, communication services tax, all the taxes that businesses are required to file and pay. I don't cover ad valorem taxes or property taxes. I don't cover child support enforcement cases. We have advocates that take care of that. And so when I receive a phone call or an email from a taxpayer who has a question about, for example, I had one earlier today from a citizen in Florida who's having issues with their homestead exemption with one of the counties. And what I did was I refer that to our property tax division here at the Department of Revenue, and they handle those. Yeah, child support is its own area in the Department of Revenue, and I forward those to the advocate that's over in the child support area.
Okay. Anybody else?
Yeah, I'm responsible for personal income tax and corporate income tax. For the state of California, our sister agencies are the Employment Development Department, and they do everything for employees. They have their own advocate. We also have the Board of Equalization that deals with property taxes, and they work with the local authorities, and they also have their own advocate. And I think that was it. I want to plug a couple programs that we have also. One of the things that I get to oversee is our taxpayer appeals. What is it called? It's called the Taxpayer Appeals Assessment Program. And it is this wonderful program that's separate and apart. We have an attorney that reaches out and gives training to California University law students who are able to come on in, and they're able to work cases that qualify based on income and issue to actually go before our Office of Tax Appeals, which is California's tax court. And these students will represent these underserved taxpayers before or against the Franchise Tax Board. So it's a beautiful program that helps these underserved. It also is a great recruiting tool for our audit or our tax departments. That, and then we also partner with the federal government, and we offer voluntary income tax assistance program, VITA programs, and we partner with all of our elected officials. They will sponsor different opportunities at their departments. And prior to the pandemic, one of the things that I thought was really brilliant was we partnered with FEMA and used their FEMA buses and went down to through the beautiful Central Valley of California and allowed those that were working out in the fields to be able to come on in and for free get their federal and state income tax returns done. So these are just some of the extra things that we're trying to do to help the underserved taxpayers. So thank you for letting me brag about some of the things that we're able to do.
And then, yeah, to answer your question, Anna, so Oregon does not have a sales tax, but all the other taxes that touch the Department of Revenue, I get to weigh in on. And the way that I look at it, so property tax is a great example, since most of our counties actually administer it, but the Department of Revenue provides all the guidance. So for example, if somebody calls with a property tax complaint, as I start talking to them, if it is because they feel like the county isn't doing something right by the policies the state has given them, then I work with our property tax unit. So as long as it's the Department of Revenue's policies or something that touches them, then I'm still working within that. And then we always just try to help. Like if they do need to talk to their county assessor, we're more than happy to track that information down for them and put them in touch with them too.
Well, this has just been terrific, and I'm just so thrilled to hear this work that you all are doing in very diverse areas, you know, because the state systems are different. And but there are themes throughout. So I just thank you all for doing this, and I thank all the attendees for staying through, and you'll be able to watch this again. And this concludes our workshop series, but not our work. We're going to continue with the survey, and we will be posting the results as they come in, and ultimately issuing a report with recommendations, including the model legislation. So thank you all. This has been just terrific, and thank you, panelists. Bye.